Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel on finding your path to your best emotional and physical health, and my series on dealing with complex PTSD and some of the ways to identify things that are going on with that so you can move towards better relationships and better health. So before I get into today's topic, please remember to subscribe so you get notified when new videos come out once or twice a week. And also don't be afraid to download my 5 free videos on steps to finding your best emotional and physical health, because they will help you lay the foundation of some of the things that we need to look out for when we're developing relationships and our best self. So with that, let me get into today's topic. So today I'm going to talk a little bit more about the outer critic. We've been talking about the inner critic, which was the last video, and I'll try to remember to put a link in here so that we can follow up on that a little bit. But the outer critic is the kind of manifestation of boundaries we try to put up in the world, and not necessarily a healthy way either. These are the negative boundaries. So this is the part where people think everybody else is flawed. The inner critic is the one where they're thinking they are flawed. The outer critic is where the person is kind of feeding into the everybody else is flawed and everybody else is unworthy, and that's because they feel that they're dangerous. People are too dangerous to trust because they learned that early on that people were not safe. Okay, so that comes from early childhood trauma. So when we see people, of course, that act out like that, and we'll talk about some of those ways that those might express themselves in a little bit later video, but as people kind of express that outwardly, they use it as a barrier to intimacy, and like I said, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But the regression to the outer critic is something where people really obsess about the imperfections of others, okay, and they kind of get in that everybody else is dangerous. You might kind of recognize some of that going on at a societal level right now, because as we're sitting in the middle of a pandemic, for those of you that are watching this later, we are still in it's 2021, and we're still in the middle of a lot of news, and we're going to talk about how news affects things and how that's used to kind of put people in kind of a negative light and really kind of triggering for them. But in a nutshell, when people are using the outer critic and they're using it against the people around them, they're using it to avoid emotional investment in relationships because they've been deemed dangerous as a childhood. So they're really the most common, and we've talked about the different types, right? The four F types, all the different fight, flight, freeze, or fawn types, and you can look at some of my earlier videos about those. So as we look at those, some of these people actually are going to go towards more the outer critic, and some are going to go towards the inner critic, and we'll kind of talk about that balance a little bit in a minute. But the outer critic is really common in the freeze and fight types, okay, which makes sense with the fight type, right? Because they're going to put up these big boundaries and try to control people and whatever. The freeze types are more quiet about their outer critic. They aren't always like telling you that these people are dangerous, but that is exactly what they believe. So that's why they withdraw and they freeze. Fawn types, a little bit more dominated by the inner critic, and those are the ones that kind of really stay stuck in that, and they're not going to criticize the people they are fawning over, because that would cause problems. So flight types, those are the ones that kind of vacillate back and forth, much, much more common, because they can go from the inner critic to the outer critic really quickly, and they use both. They feel themselves are unlovable, but then they also feel people are dangerous and they can't move towards that. So they use that as a barrier to intimacy. And I have met and worked with several flight types. These actually surprise me because I might think they might be more fight types, but then they end up being more flight types based on some of these behaviors. And you don't always know what's going on with the inner critic piece. So the outer critic piece is pretty obvious sometimes because it's how they work with others. But then you don't know what their internal monologue look like. They don't even know what their internal monologue is sometimes. So if you're looking at all relationships from the lens of parental abandonment, which is what a lot of childhood trauma is, then it makes sense that this outer critic has kind of stayed up and stayed active, because it is what keeps everybody on guard and keeps the person kind of focused on this, what could happen, and kind of prevents the same losses that they had before. You get these, like I said, the flight types that are kind of like this. They are the ones that really kind of use that kind of busyness and that kind of critical of others as a barrier to intimacy. Because if other people are flawed, then those people aren't worth having a relationship with. But eventually these people realize that they do that to everyone, and there's no one worth having a relationship with, right? And then they prevent intimacy on all levels with all people. They don't always realize this right off the bat, but I can think of a number of people that do that on a regular basis. And unfortunately, when you step back and as a provider and as somebody that cares about how these people function, you can see that, and sometimes they don't, and they're just not ready to see those pieces and heal their lives yet. And that's okay, but they'll get there eventually, or we hope so, right? So what happens when they're really kind of young is they kind of also learn that kind of protesting or acting against parental unfairness is just not allowed, and that it's going to be punished. And so that leads to kind of some repressed anger about being unable to express themselves and that kinds of stuff. And then they take it out on others, regardless of whether those others are actually doing those things to them or not. Like their parents did, they get that interpretation that people will do that if you let them get close enough, right? So in a nutshell, some of these early childhood traumas where they've lacked a supportive parental figure kind of leads them to not learn, or basically they don't learn that humans can provide, some kind of soothing and support and love, and actually help someone heal from loneliness and pain. They do not see that happening with other humans. So they end up being attached to things like work, busyness, animals sometimes. And sometimes it's a good place to start. I mean, don't get me wrong, support animals and emotional support animals are a good place, because a good place to start with building those relationships. But some people never make it past that to building a relationship actually with human beings, because animals do provide those things that the parents couldn't do, but they're not humans, and they can't quite go to the level that other humans can, at that level of intimacy, just because they can't. They're animals. So some people kind of get stuck in that healing where they can kind of learn to maybe accept some kind of love and support from other beings, but they just don't quite move to the next level because of that fear, and that fear keeps them blocked from moving forward. So that's kind of in a nutshell where the outer critic comes from, and some of the things that kind of start to happen and what's going on with someone. And in our next video, we're going to get into some of just the signs and the behaviors of the outer critic, so we can kind of recognize when that's been activated and the things we can do. And eventually we'll get into the things we can do to stop that. So if you think you need any more additional coaching on this, please connect with me on the website. We'll definitely get you fixed up with help to figure out how we can move forward and improve our relationships. So thanks everybody, and have a great day.